Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on the Michigan Energy Code adoption process. This is the second webinar in a series that we just launched called the Clean Energy and Energy Management webinar series. It's a collaboration between the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, and the University of Michigan. I'm Sarah Mills. I'm a researcher at the University of Michigan, and I manage our collaboration with EGLE. This is just one part of a bigger project to help communities across the state set policies and develop programs related to clean energy. And helping me on the webinar today is Leah Edelman, a student in U of M's Public Policy School, who has helped pull together these webinars and will helping specifically with the Q&A. For today's webinar, we'll take any questions via the questions feature on the GoToWebinar console. As you can see on the screen, it's toward the bottom of that console, and that should be on the right side of your screen. We encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the speakers' presentations by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console. We'll likely hold the questions until after the third speaker, but then Leah will pose the questions to the panel. When you submit a question, it's only visible to organizers, so don't panic if you don't see any questions populating there. Our format for the webinar today is to start with Jake Wilkinson at EGLE, who will provide an overview of what the Energy Code is intended to do. And then Jon Paradine, who is in the Bureau of Construction Codes at LARA, the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, will talk a bit more specifically about the Michigan Energy Code. And then Tony Snyder, who is the Bureau's attorney, will talk about how that code gets updated and the opportunities for communities to get involved. As I mentioned earlier, we'll pause for questions at the end of their presentations, and then we'll have Missy Stoltz, who is the Sustainability and Innovations Manager for the City of Ann Arbor, talk a little bit about an opportunity for communities to work together on bringing local government perspectives into the Energy Code. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jake.
Hello, everyone. This is Jake Wilkinson. As Sarah said, I am with EGLE in the Energy Services Unit. There's my contact information. I'm just going to give some basic overview of how codes are kind of developed. So first, what are energy codes? They set the rules that govern energy use in a building and how buildings are constructed. And so the code is the minimum requirements that a building can meet to be legal or permitted. And I do like the phrase, it's the worst home that can legally be built. So the code is not necessarily something to shoot for, it's something that you must meet. Hopefully people will want to exceed the code, but a lot of times they are just building to code. There's two organizations that develop national model codes on a national level. So there's the International Codes Council, or the ICC, as well as ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating and Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers. They generally post a new model code every 3 years on differing schedules, and how much those codes improve depends on a variety of factors, from what type of technology is being developed. For ICC, there's a pretty extensive voting process that can get more efficient or less efficient things voted into the code. So the current editions out there, I think ASHRAE might be at 2019 now, but I'd have to check on that. ICC, the 2018 is published. 2021 is currently still being finalized. I think they're very close, but I have not actually seen it published completely yet or official yet. So in Michigan specifically, and it's true a lot of the places around Midwest especially, the state adopts the code and municipalities enforce it. Now, like I said, that varies, and we'll get into that in a couple of slides, a couple of the different examples, but generally states will adopt the code on a statewide level. Next slide, please. So there's two codes, energy codes, I should say, in Michigan. There's the residential code and the commercial code. Residential covers residential buildings, so homes, as well as anything 3 stories or less. Commercial is non-residential and anything more than 3 stories. They both apply to new construction, and then they also apply to major alterations or additions, retrofits, stuff like that. Historic buildings being one of the exceptions. So if you have a lot of cities I know have historic town halls and stuff, there may be times where the code doesn't apply to those. Next slide, please. So the first codes were established in the 70s, first energy codes anyway. Like all building codes, they are life safety codes. So rather than on the structural integrity of the wall or the roof, they focus on largely indoor air quality, so temperature, humidity, trying to make sure that it's a safe environment to inhabit with the people there. And the codes are constantly improving every time they make a new addition. And since the first codes in the 70s, they've improved about 50%. So a building built to code today would use about 50% of the energy used as a building built back in the 70s, while still meeting the same requirements as far as air quality and all of that. So next slide, please. So this is just a little graphic of the improvement of the commercial energy code. Again, back in the 70s was when the first codes were established, and they normalized the EUI, which is the energy use intensity. So EUI is typically the energy use in BTUs or MMBTUs per square foot per year, but they normalized that to be 100, just so you can see an easy scale as it progressed. And every code, like I said, is a little different. Sometimes they make big jumps and sometimes they make smaller ones. This was actually put together by the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. They're a good resource for codes here in the Midwest. And they did the analysis along the side there, where you can see the percentage of increase for those various years. But they've been pretty successful with that. So you can see, sometimes it's pretty low, and other times we make big jumps. Commercial code is generally ASHRAE codes, as you can see there, and that they seem to be a little more consistent, I guess, with their improvements. Now the residential code, same type of system. They normalized it at 100 in the 70s. And then they've been making improvements there. You can see that, like, the 2018 Icc had very little, and even the 2015 had very little improvements. But then before that, we had a 25% jump. In the drafts I've seen of the 2021, we could be looking at around a 10% jump, rough numbers, but constantly trying to improve and make these buildings more efficient based on code. Next slide, please. So they do that through a number of ways. There's a lot of focus on HVAC systems, mechanical systems, as far as how you bring fresh air into the building, trying to recover energy from it. Envelope improvements like insulation or air barriers, windows, as well as typical things you'd expect like lighting and other internal sources of energy use. But that's just kind of a brief overview. The code is very extensive and covers basically every part of a building that might use energy. So you could go on for a long time talking about that, but this gives a pretty good overview. So next slide, please. Again, like I said, there's 2 model energy codes, ASHRAE 90.1, and they said they do every 3 years. I think the 2019 should be out by now. I haven't looked for it specifically. And then IECC, which the 2021 should be coming out early next year, I believe. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the Midwest and where the states are at in their code adoption process. As you can see, we're pretty well right in the middle. A lot of the states that are green right now on the 2018 just recently updated. We're still on the 2015 for the residential code. And then you can see down in like Missouri, I was talking generally a state will adopt the code. There are some that don't do it that way. Missouri is one of those. Looks like the Dakotas are too. So individual cities in those cases can adopt a code and enforce the code. But in most states, like Michigan, the state adopts the code, but then everyone follows that code. And if we go to the next slide, we have a very similar map for the commercial code. And you can see that we are, again, kind of in the middle. I think Minnesota has since updated since this was out, maybe Ohio as well. The ones with the lines through it, you can see they were in the process of a code update. I believe those have been completed, so they're probably on the 18 by now. But, you know, we're not so bad, pretty well in the middle, but we continually try and update our codes, and I think John might get into that a little bit in his presentation. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess we're handing it over to John. So thank you, and if you had any questions, please type them in the chat, and we can get to those later.
I'm Jon Paradine, Chief of the Building and Permits Division with the state of Michigan. So I'm more on the enforcement side, and I work with the rules adoption at the national level for the state of Michigan for the Bureau of Construction Codes. Next slide, please. Michigan adopts what we call the Michigan Energy Code, and we incorporate the Icc and the ASHRAE 90.1 into one code book, so we can adopt those and have just one place to go for inspectors to use and contractors. Next slide, please. Little history. All units of government who administer and enforce the construction code are required to use the rules promulgated under 1972 PA 230 of the State Construction Code Act. And that's kind of Jake was saying, as the state, we adopt the codes for construction at our level, and then either we enforce it in some areas, or it'll be under a local authority, a local building department to enforce the codes. Amendments to the construction code rules took effect for this current one in 2017. In the year of 1999 is when the state began using the international codes as a basis for our Michigan codes. That is when Boca and Southern Cabo merged in, became ICC, International Code Council. Next slide, please. The Michigan Energy Code is broken down into two sections. We have commercial provisions and residential provisions. Commercial code has 5 chapters, and residential basically has 1 chapter, and that is because it is also in the residential code, the 2015 Michigan Residential Code. Next slide, please. A little bit on the commercial code. First chapter is scope and application. It's just where it is used, and the inspection and enforcement requirements are covered here. There's, as with every code, there's definitions. An example of a greenhouse. So if an inspector is looking for an actual definition of trying to figure out how it applies, this is where he would go, and it gives the definition of what a greenhouse is for this code. Then we'll have the general requirements for permits, requirements, what code's into effect, how we enforce it in certain areas. And then section 4 is on the commercial energy efficiencies, is where we get the efficiencies for the equipment that's going in, the walls, the bare wall barriers, vapor barriers, those type of things. All that comes into that next section. And we have one section for existing buildings. That is where the historical and existing buildings would be found to when we need to update the energy portions of those sections, and when it would apply and when it would not apply. And that's where your local building departments or the enforcing agencies will use this to decide how to, in what codes to enforce. Next slide, please. Residential code is chapter 1, is the energy efficiency, and that's the information at the beginning is roughly the same as the commercial codes. The only difference with the commercial code is all of this is actually in the Michigan Residential Code, Chapter 11. So it's incorporated into one book for residential 1 and 2 family dwellings. So the inspector has one book to take with him or use, and he can get everything in that book from energy, building, mechanicals, electrical, that's covered in there, and the mandatory requirements are covered in there. The commercial code is ASHRAE 90.1 is what we've adopted in the state of Michigan. And again, all that information's in one book. It was in the slides that Jake had in his presentation is the one we use. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of, this is what the Icc adoption that Jake spoke to of, and this is where we travel and go to. There's a panel of the International Energy Conservation Code. They have a panel of professionals that sit on the panel and make decisions on the codes. The people that you see sitting outside are the ones that are following the codes. They have made proposals, and they will also speak on to those proposals. So it is, the proposed changes are carefully considered through an open code development process so that everybody has a chance to put in their request for a new code so that they can at least be heard and it can be voted on by that panel. And then it is out to the voting ICC officials, and it's voted on as a group, and it's either passed or moved on. And at that point in time, the government, at that point, once it's passed and got to the 2021 is the next one, it would be up to the state governments at that point to either adopt it or make our own amendments, which in the state of Michigan, we do make our own amendments to it to make it our code so it reflects what's in the state of Michigan. We may not need what Florida has or California for some of our codes. So, and next slide, please. And I think Tony is up now. So.
All right, thank you very much, JP. I appreciate it. My name is Tony Snyder. I'm an attorney with the Bureau of Construction Codes, and I also work with the rules analyst who does the actual pen to paper, so to speak, on what our codes look like. There are a few things that I want folks to walk away knowing and understanding about the process. The first one there, under that statutory authority, we have a particular act called the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. And if you want to write that down, it's the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. It's also commonly referred to as Public Act 306 of 1969. The value of the Administrative Procedures Act is it's an act that was enacted by the legislature that essentially tells us departments how we have to process rules, what we're required to do as it relates to promulgating rules pursuant to these acts that are created. And the way I kind of explain it is, I think of an act as nothing more than just a skeleton. And the rules are really, all of the organs and the skin that gets put onto the skeleton itself to actually make it a functional working body, because the act is going to give you just kind of the bare minimum outline of what the act requires, but how you do it and how you implement it is where the rule promulgation comes in. So PA 306 of 1969 is one of the acts that we use. Another act that I'd ask you to write down is the Construction Code Act, the Construction Code Act, and that is Public Act 230 of 1972. And I share this verbiage with you because if you Google it, that's the terminology that you'll be able to immediately pull up the acts that I'm referencing to be able to read it and to understand it. So we have this requirement that we've got to adopt codes. we adopt the building code, we adopt the residential code, we adopt the plumbing code, we adopt the energy code, right? We've got these codes that are listed in PA 230, and PA is just the abbreviation for Public Act. So you've got PA 230 that says these are the codes that you have to adopt. And then we'll go through and we'll, as JP aptly points out, we'll go through and we tweak to a small extent the individual codes to be more applicable for Michigan. Because remember, what comes out of ICC is being used across the country. And as Jon Paradine, he goes by JP in the office, as Jon Paradine points out, listen, there are some requirements that don't make sense for Michigan as it relates to, say, Florida, because they don't get any snow, or relatively they get no snow, versus like, let's just say Montana, where they get a ton of snow. And so we are allowed to go in and we're allowed to tweak this code and make it our own code, so to speak. And truly, there is one of the most interesting things, and I know interesting is a relative term, right? But one of the interesting things is we have different load-bearing requirements for roofs of homes depending on where in the state of Michigan you live. Why? Because you get a lot more snow in the UP, which a roof is going to have to hold a lot more snow and bear the weight of snow a lot more than, say, down in the Berrien, Cass County, Lenawee, Wayne County areas, which are so much, further south. So those are the two acts that I would recommend folks keep on hand. We're going to talk about the code and rule promulgation process and how you can get involved. So if you wouldn't mind, Sarah, could we go to the next slide, please? All right. So I've already mentioned the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act, and the act gives us essentially these 4 bullet points on conceptually how to behave. But again, remember, gang, this is a 30,000 foot overview of what the APA is going to require, and we'll get deeper into the weeds here in just a minute. But what does the Administrative Procedures Act require? We have to do something called a request for rulemaking authority, and what that means is we literally say, okay, at this time, state of Michigan, we would like the authority to open up the rules and start promulgating code, assuming that we get that authority, and by all rights, you will. The next step then is you got to draft the actual rule language. And what strike and bold means is we strike out language that may be outdated, or Jake talks about how each code kind of gets updated a little bit better as science and technology continues to progress. We may strike out old language that is no longer applicable or may not be applicable to Michigan. So if there's something that is more specific about heat and humidity for Florida that may not be applicable for Michigan, we can strike that out. But we can also put new language in. We can put in language that's more specific for Michigan, and that would be done in bold language. All right. Once we've gone through and we have a general idea, we have a draft set of rules of what we think this code is going to look like, we have to write out a regulatory impact statement. And I'll get to that in just a second. That's very important. The regulatory impact statement is a document that we as the Bureau of Construction Codes, I mean, all bureaus, all departments have to do this, but so what we do is, as the Bureau of Construction Codes, is when we draft up this regulatory impact statement, we have to lay out certain things required by the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. Things like, what is the potential cost impact of doing this? What is the logistical impact of doing this or of not doing it? So why or why not something gets done has to be included in this regulatory impact statement. Finally, there's a public hearing, and I want to pause for just a quick second to talk about this. This public hearing is the only requirement under the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act that's required. There's one time that the APA says you must have a public meeting with the good citizens of Michigan. And this is a one-way conversation. So when we hold these public hearings, this isn't a two-way communication. This isn't us saying, well, we thought about this and we wanted to work in that. It's just you tell us what you think about the proposed strike and bold draft rules that we've put up. That's the only time a public hearing is required pursuant to the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. But next slide, please. We do it a little bit differently. And although this flow chart may look crazy, I promise it's going to make a lot more sense here in just a second. Let me, if I can though, before I start to work through and explain what the different boxes mean, let me or what's in each box and what it means. Let's talk about why you're seeing two different colors of boxes. You see what looks to be like a blue background to begin with, and then you see a blue background set of boxes to complete. So those last 5 boxes are kind of a blue background. The blue background boxes are what's required pursuant to the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. All right, the things that are in the well, lack of a better term, the black and white boxes with the red perimeter, that's our own personal Bureau of Construction Codes process. And every bureau within every department does this a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, we as a bureau in the department, we must do what's in those darker blue colored boxes. That's what the Michigan Administrative Procedure Act tells us we must do. Anything before we get into that Administrative Procedures Act is entirely up to the bureau to decide how they want to handle it. So let's go through these. You'll note the very first step is we do that RFR, that request for rulemaking. So again, we ask the state of Michigan for permission to start drafting up a code. Now, two things is going to happen. Two things will happen here. If applicable, you'll notice that top box there. If applicable, the board will be notified of the rule opening at the meeting. And the reason why we put that in there is if we're dealing with the plumbing code, we let the plumbing board know that their rule set is being open, that their code is being open. We want them to be aware of it. Now, I say applicable because we don't technically have an energy board. All right, energy falls under the Michigan Construction Code Commission, which if you read PA 230, you'll kind of see what the Construction Code Commission, who sits on the Construction Code Commission, what their authority is, things like that. Likewise, at the same time that we're notifying the board, we're also sending out an email to licensees, to stakeholders, to subscribers, essentially letting folks that are interested in knowing this say, hey, we're opening up this particular code. Do you have any interest in being involved in this code or even just monitoring the process? And if you are, and it comes as an email, if you're interested in being kept abreast of this particular code, and again, gang, it could be plumbing, electrical, building, energy, but it also could be areas where you may or may not have an interest in it. If you're on the email distribution, you're still going to get notification when we're dealing with ski rules. And when ski, I mean like, skiing down a hill, ski. We have elevators, so you'll get notification of elevators. Land division, when we're talking about going out and figuring out exactly where plots of land are, you'll get notified of that. So just be aware, if you sign up for the overall email distribution, you're going to get a whole bunch of notifications about acts or codes that are being promulgated, which you may or may not have interest in, and that's okay. The idea then is if you are interested in that particular code that's being promulgated, in the email, when you get notified, you're going to be told, click this link, type in the name of the code that you are interested in, and we'll add you to an email distribution. So then what happens is we may have 10,000 people that get emailed saying we're opening the carnival. So for example, the Bureau of Construction Codes, we also regulate the carnivals that travel around the state of Michigan during the summer times. If you're not interested in the carnival rule set, fine, you delete the email, everything's done, you go on your merry way. If you are interested in the carnival rule set, you would simply click the email that's embedded within the email itself, and you would say, please subscribe me to the carnival rule set. And then anytime there's progress being made on the carnival rule set, you would receive an email from us. All right. When we send that email out saying, if you're interested in this particular code, let us know. We also include a form. It's a PDF, I don't know what the proper English is, fillable form, right? Like you actually put fingers to keyboard, and you can type right in this PDF document. You would save it, and you can then email it to us with your code proposals, and we allow 4 weeks for that to be done. So during those 4 weeks, as you're starting to send in your recommendations, Jon Paradine and the chair of the Construction Code Commission, they're going to sit down and they're going to go through that energy code, and they're going to kind of compare the existing code of what we are operating under, and they're going to compare it against the new code to kind of figure out what sort of changes have they made. As Jake again pointed out, each code cycle gets a little bit more sophisticated. So Jon Paradine and the chair of the Construction Code Commission need to kind of figure out what those differences are. So we're getting your suggestions in at the same time as John and the chair are sitting down and going through it. At the end of that 4 weeks, what John and the chair will do is they will go through all of the recommendations, all the code proposals that we received from folks just like you. All right, so they'll sit down and they'll look through it and they'll see what were the suggested changes, good, bad, or otherwise. What did you think? What did you think should or shouldn't be in the code and why? And they have about a week to sit down to figure that out. Once they have a general idea then of what this draft code is going to look like, we give a 10-day notice that will be sent out to the respective board members if there's a board that is applicable for this code. We'll also send it out to the folks that wanted to be a part of the email distribution, letting them know that we're going to set up an informal hearing. Essentially, we call it an advisory meeting. Now, again, this is not required under the APA, but it's something that we see value in, because what we want to do is once we have a draft code put together, what we think is probably what the code's going to generally look like, we want to have a conversation. We want to have a back and forth two-way conversation with folks. So we'll send out notification. You'll get at least 10 days notice of when it is. And this is an opportunity then for the Bureau and individuals to go back and forth and say, all right, well, where was your head at? Why did you keep this in? Or where was your head at? Why didn't you include that? You know, it's our way of saying, well, it could be a way of us saying, well, we weren't really sure what your goal was. So thanks for showing up for this informal meeting. It gives us an opportunity to flesh it out a little bit more and find out where your head's at. But this is your chance to talk directly to us, and we talk directly back to you and say, all right, we appreciate that feedback, because you know, consider it like round one, if you will, of proofreading the document. Maybe not the best way to phrase it, but I'm going to roll with that. All right, so we're going to give you at least 10 days. So yep, exactly right where the cursor is pointing down with the 10 days. Exactly, we're going to hold that meeting. Then boom, we're going to move over, and then what we'll do is the Bureau is we'll take the comments that we got from you folks at this informal meeting where you said, well, why did you do this, or did you think about doing that? And we'll go back and we'll edit the code. You know, we'll tweak the code based on the recommendations that we received from you from that informal hearing. And what we do though is this is again an opportunity where John, who enforces the energy code at the state level, with the chair of the Construction Code Commission, who and let me. I'm trying not to get too lost in the weeds here. The value of the Construction Code Commission is it's, think of it like an appellate court, right? So you've got a decision that might get made at the local level, and a local inspector might make a decision. And if the building constructor, the person that's building the building, says, I don't think you got this quite right, Mr. Inspection Person, you can appeal it to your local Board of Appeals. The Board of Appeals will hear the appeal. The building constructor will say, you know, my argument is A, B, and C. The inspector will say, well, my argument is X, Y, Z, and the Board of Appeals gets to make that decision. Whichever side loses at the Board of Appeals has the opportunity to appeal up to the state level, which is the Construction Code Commission, again, pursuant to PA 230. So our thought is why not take the person at the state level, meaning John, who enforces the energy code, have him sit down and look at the code with the chair of the Construction Code Commission, since they would hear an appeal, and let those folks, you know, build what they think is the strongest energy code or building code or plumbing code or whatever the case might be. And because they would also get the appeal, that's why we like hearing from the locals. Well, what are you dealing with? What are boots on the ground dealing with? Okay. So I belabored that point. I'll move along. That's where we get in then to exactly right where the cursor is now, that first kind of dark blue box there. This is where we now get into the actual Administrative Procedures Act. Now we're being told by an act what we must do. And one of those things that we must do is we must schedule a formal hearing. And before we can hold the formal hearing, we have to do things like publish it in a newspaper, not less than 10 days, but no more than 60 days before, right? So there's a window. We can't give you no notice. We have to give you at least 10 days notice, but we also can't set it so far out into the future that you're likely to forget about it, 6 months out. So we have a window, no less than 10, no more than 60 days is when we're going to have to hold the formal hearing, and you'll find out about it, particularly if you're on that email distribution. Now, the Act says that we have to do this in 3 different newspapers, but that's all we have to do according to the APA. We, however, say, but that doesn't really cover, that doesn't get people the information that we want the people to know. So if you're on our email distribution list, you're going to get the notification of when our formal hearing is being held. So if I move into that next box, at the public hearing, all the folks that wish to show up, we call them interested parties, they have another opportunity to provide comment. Because remember, gang, we've amended the code, potentially, we've amended the proposed draft code from back when we did the informal hearing. Everybody showed up, they gave us the feedback, we had that two-way conversation. We may have worked in some of the changes that we received from that informal into our draft, and now we're here at the formal hearing, and this is your opportunity then to say, either why didn't you work in what I recommended to you at the informal, or you say, right on, right on, right on. You saw the light, Bureau, and you worked my recommendations into the draft. Okay. The thing about the formal, though, is at that point, the draft code is pretty much cemented. We as a Bureau, under the Administrative Procedures Act, we can only change the proposed code if you show up at the formal hearing and say, I think this should be a part of the code. Doesn't mean we will or we have to, but we can't change it on our own. So if you come up with a great idea, but you don't show up at the formal hearing to present it to us at that time, we're locked in with what we have. Because pursuant to the APA, and holy cow, I'm really sorry, friends. I don't know why this particular, when I sent it over, why this particular box, the text of it shrunk down like it did. So I can't quite really make out here what it's saying here. Let me see if I put it in full view. Yeah, I'm not, effectively what's going on here with these last 3. And the good news is, by the way, the good news is, I spoke with Sarah before this got started. Sarah's going to post this document, all of these slides, to the website. You'll be able to get this, and you'll be able to see it a little bit better, a little bit larger on your screen once it gets printed off, or email me and I'd be happy to email it to you. But these last 3, exactly. Thanks for putting that up, Sarah. So those boxes that have the red circles around them, this is where you actually have the opportunity to talk directly to us. You either talk directly to us with that first circle where you're being notified that the energy code is open, and here's the PDF typable document for you to send us your recommendations of what you think should or should not be in the energy code. Then that second red circle there, yep, perfect, is the second time you get to talk to us, and that's literally face to face. I mean, in a perfect world, we'd be back in a room together, but we've been doing these through Zoom thus far. But regardless, somehow like this, you get to see my face, I can see your face if you so choose, and we talk about what the code is there in that second one. And then the third circle there, the last circle, or is the last time, again, you get a chance to talk to us. But remember, it's a one-way conversation. You're talking to us, the Bureau. It's not a back and forth. It's a here's why I think you should absolutely have put something in the code that you didn't, or here's something I think that you should have taken out of the code, but you left in, or, and nobody ever does this, but you could also show up and tell me what a great job I did on the code. So this particular form is the document that's going to be included with the email when we tell you that the energy code has been opened. And this is the form that you're going to actually fill out. This is the typable form. So look at, I want things like the date, your name, who you represent, what's your proposed language. But please note, about halfway down, you're going to see the word reason. It's in bold. And then you see these small little bullet pointed sentences. Can we go to the next one? There we go. So what you just saw beneath the word reason with the bullet points is this orange language right here. Now, let me slow down and talk about this for a hot second. We, as a bureau, as a department, we are told by the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act, we must address these questions for all of our code. We need to identify problems. We need to explain rationale of proposed changes. We need to describe what the environmental impact is. I mean, I'm not going to, you can read it for yourself. I'm not going to read it to you. But the point is, we ask you, when you submit something to us as a bureau, if you say, I want something included in the code that's not already in the code, or I want something taken out of the code, you got to justify it to us, not because we are the ones that you got to justify it to. It's because we have to pass that information along to the legislature. All right, the legislature will read these things, and a lot of times, if we can't get into your head and figure out why you're proposing the code change that you're proposing, then it's hard for us to answer these questions when it comes time for us to explain to the legislature why we're working in your recommendations. So in this form, and it's not uncommon, we'll get the form plus we'll get a 1 or 2 or 3 page single spaced Word document where people have gone through those bullet points one by one, and they've, you know, laid an answer out 2 or 3 paragraphs deep for each bullet point on why that particular change should be made. All right, so please don't ignore the justification provisions, because these justification provisions are literally right from the Michigan Administrative Procedures Act. We did not make this up. This is not something that you have to justify to us to get put into the code. It's something that if we see the value of why your code proposal should be worked into the code, we're going to rely on what you're providing us here in those bullet points to help justify that reason to the legislature. Next one. Okay, so how do you get involved? I've probably belabored the point a little bit too much. I apologize. I did tell them ahead of time, never give an attorney, you know, all the time in the world to talk, but these are all hyperlinks. So when you get this document, you'll be able to click on these. If you want to be proactive right now, you can always email lara-bcc-rules@michigan.gov and just say, please put me on the energy code email distribution list. And you will only get that particular code email updates. If you click the sign up or update subscriber preference, that's where you can put in an email address and you'll get all of the codes that I've been talking about: plumbing and construction and carnival and elevator and ski and land and stuff like that, which again, nothing wrong with getting it. Delete it if you don't want the email. I think that's my last slide. Do I have one more? All right. Very, very, very quickly, Bureau of Construction Codes has a website. You can click to it there. We have something called the statewide jurisdiction list. This is just a nice way of being able to see what municipalities enforce which codes. By default, we as the state, we enforce all codes in all municipalities, but pursuant to PA 230, local municipalities can take that enforcement jurisdiction, and we have a PDF that lets you know by county which townships, villages, cities enforce which codes. Oh yeah, as we note right there in enforcing agency. So that's all I've got.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to thank the panelists and then turn it over to you, Leah. So.
All right. Yes. Thank you to the panelists. We have some questions. So the first is, does the state ever leapfrog over code? So could we move from the 2015 code over the 2018 one directly to the 2021 code?
We could. Yes, we could. As a matter of fact, as it relates to the residential code, we are going to leapfrog the 2018 residential code, and we're only tweaking the chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the residential code. Otherwise, we're keeping the 2015 residential code, and we'll start to deal with the Michigan residential code with the 2021 version.
So we are in the 2015 code. Can you clarify which year of the residential and commercial code Michigan has currently adopted?
2015 for both of them.
Next question is there any sense of when the RFR for the energy code will come out?
I think a Ouija and a magic 8-ball will answer that. But if I had to guess, if I looked into my my crystal ball, I would say probably March or April of next year. But please don't hold me to that. That is a tentative date.
Okay. And the next question is, how might we tweak the code for Michigan? What's the process like, and is there space in that for municipalities to participate?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would go back to that flow chart where Sarah had the red circles around the 3 different boxes. The way you tweak. Okay, so let me be clear. The technical question was, how do we tweak the Michigan code? You don't really tweak the Michigan code. We tweak the ICC, the International Construction Code. Once we tweak it, it becomes the Michigan code, and we will use that code until we adopt the next code that comes out by ICC. So if you're interested in, how about this? If there are things in any of the current Michigan codes, the 2015 codes that you don't like, that's where you would submit that form with the justifications, the different bullet points, whatnot. That's where you would submit to us with the next code and say, we think this provision should be changed, should be modified somewhere, somehow.
All right, thank you. I want to clarify, any of these questions can be answered by any of the panelists if you're interested. Our next question is Michigan required by law to use the international codes as our basis, or could there be another model or type of code used?
That is a great question. JP, while I pull up PA 230, can you address that?
PA 230 references the IBC, the IC, or the IMC. It references the ICC codes, and that is what we have to base our codes off on right now.
So then the answer to that person's question is no, we can't use a different code to use as our foundation. We must use, and I'm reading it right here, the code shall consist of the International Residential Code, the International Building Code, the International Mechanical Code, so on and so forth.
All right, thank you. Next question is, when considering code changes, do the staff/chair start with the new model code as the basis, or do they start with the old code currently in effect?
JP, can you feel that one?
We actually compare the two codes. ICC does a comparison between the two codes, and we'll use that between the two. But we do look at the 15 and the 18 and our Michigan codes because we have our own provisions to see if any of those have changed. So we'll sit down, go through each one of those. And on the energy, we have other people involved with the other chiefs from plumbing, electrical, and mechanical, because they'll have provisions in there also.
All right. Next, we have a question kind of about the lengthiness of the code and how readable it is. Is it actually possible to read the whole code and recommended revisions within 4 weeks?
You know, I can't really answer that question for a number of reasons. Number one, I don't know how long it'll take you to read it. I don't know how long it'll take you to understand it. My usual recommendation is what, as JP just spoke about, it's probably easier to figure out what the changes are between one cycle code and the other, and then kind of go from there and figure out what between what's new versus what's old, kind of compared in there. But there could be something in the, you know, on a random page that's been there for 30 years that someone says, well, I mean, maybe that's not the best way to go about it. So I can't really answer that. I'm gonna give you a good lawyer answer by answering without giving a real answer. Sorry.
Okay. Next question is, will Michigan consider adopting the 2018 IECC for residential construction? And what about commercial construction?
JP?
We're going to look at the 2018 for IECC and compare it with the ASHRAE 90.1 to see, we'll look at both of them for that. The residential is not changing, so that's something we'll have to discuss with Tony, being Chapter 11 is part of the Michigan Residential Code, and we are not adopting the 2018 Residential Code. So that is one area that we have not really discussed completely yet. So how that's going to affect things.
Okay, and next we have a question about how the code is reviewed. It says, is a team effort a better approach? Perhaps committees of stakeholders to review each chapter?
So great question, JP. If you don't mind, let me at least get started, and I'll welcome you to jump in with any additional thoughts that you might have. We did do a committee process prior to the process that we're working right now. The problem that we found with the committee process was there were a number of problems. Problem number one is it was left to the director of the Bureau to decide who the winner or loser was that got to be on the committee. And so we had a lot of folks that were unhappy if they didn't get to be a part of the committee. Likewise, folks that were on the committee, and I'll be real honest with you, I don't mind putting it out there and saying there were some folks that were on the committee who looked at it as a self-serving opportunity to try to ensure that there were certain things that may or may not have been included in the code, which may or may not have directly benefited them or their industry or whatever the case might be. So that was another part. Third reason is it winds up being a group committee insofar as we get feedback from people now under this new process that were out in the cold in the past. And so it's an opportunity for anybody who wants to propose something. They don't have to be on a committee now to be able to get their idea heard. They just have to fill out that PDF document and kind of work through the justification bullet points to be able to present what they think is relevant and should be included in the panel, or excuse me, in the code. And trust me, we get especially with energy code, we're going to get everybody. I mean, we're going to get feedback from municipalities and from energy companies. We're going to get it from municipalities as well as the different trades, because at the end of the day, the energy code touches on pretty much every industry. I mean, we'll even get feedback from architects and engineers. So it's a lot of feedback that we get, and then we essentially boil it down and try to work into the energy code the best suggestions of what people will be able to work with. So between the PDF fillable document as well as that informal where we can do that back and forth, that's really where we can get most of our ideas from.
All right, we have quite a few more questions that we're just gonna go until 2. The next one is, would a possible provision related to making a building solar ready or electric vehicle charging ready be part of the energy code or some other codes?
I'm going to look to John and Jake for that answer.
There's already provisions in the code that they can put in vehicle charging. Solar's already available. It's not mandated that people have to do it, but it is there. They can put them in now. So there may be some spots in that they mandate vehicle charging now, but solar is, they can use it. They just have to follow the code. So.
Okay. The next question is, what kind of cost-benefit analysis does BCC prepare as part of the rulemaking process? How does it evaluate the costs and benefits of Michigan-specific amendments?
Great question. One of the things, so I had made mention about, we have that regulatory impact statement. In that regulatory impact statement, that's where we have to lay out essentially a cost benefit to either keeping something in or excluding something. So it's in this RIS, this regulatory impact statement, that we have to include that. And that's part of the reason why we ask folks to go through and fill out that document with those bullet points, because that's what we will rely on to help do this cost benefit analysis, or help explain this cost benefit analysis that goes into the regulatory impact statement, which ultimately goes off to the legislature.
Okay, now we have a legal feasibility question. What's the legal feasibility of a Michigan municipality enforcing a more stringent code than the Michigan State Code?
So as Jake aptly pointed out, the code is a minimum standard. So when you go in, you've got to build at least to X. Now, there may be other additional things on top of it, but at the end of the day, you do have to be cautious, because, and JP, I'm going to ask you to jump in here a little bit, because you deal with this much more. I don't get those phone calls as much as you do, so I feel like I'm somewhat grasping at straws to answer that question, but how do I do, John?
Well, the code, they can build to the Michigan building codes. Ordinances, it's very tricky if you try to go above and beyond the code and make them do all that requirements, because ultimately Public Act 230 says this is how it must be built to minimum standards. So requiring them to go above and beyond could get yourself in some legal issues. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how we enforce that. But if they build it to the Michigan code, they can actually have a legal building in the state of Michigan. We are always encouraging people, just like Jake said, to go above and beyond what the code has written. You'd want to talk with your legal staff or your legal counsel if you want to make an ordinance. We get a lot of calls where the ordinances are, or we get a few calls that ordinances may be more stricter or more restrictive. And in the end, if it comes before the commission, they may rule against it. And at that point, that's binding until it goes to circuit court or something of that nature.
All right, this is the last question. We hand it over to Missy Stoltz. Why are you not considering the 2018 residential code?
So under PA 230, we're given an opportunity to leapfrog, where if there's not enough change in one particular code to justify going through a code promulgation process, we have the authority then to go to wait until that next cycle through. When we put it out there to say, this is an opportunity where we may open up the 2018 residential code, we got, I think, one or two entities that showed up and said, I think if you're going to do anything to the code, just tweak chapters 1 and 2. So that's all we're doing for the 2018 code, is tweaking chapters 1 and 2 of the 2018 code. We're going to wait now and adopt the 2021 code as that cycle comes through.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. You have been a wealth of information, a font of information. I want to point out for people, and for the people who attended, I can't believe how many questions we got. The ones that we didn't get to answering, we will pass on to the presenters and see if there's a way that we can get you some responses. I wanted to highlight that there is another webinar next week on energy benchmarking for municipal facilities. We have folks from Washtenaw County and from the Village of Lawrence talking about the benchmarking that they've done. There is a Catalyst Communities launch in November, and then we're working on a follow-up meeting on energy codes, and I'm going to turn it over to Missy Stoltz to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you so much, Tony, Jake, and JP. This was really interesting. My hand hurts from note taking, but thank you for sharing. This was great, and Leah, thank you for facilitating the discussion. One of the things that we're interested in Ann Arbor with a bunch of other municipalities we've been talking to is understanding this process, right? And the reality is most of us don't have a lot of capacity to dive in excruciating depths, but we care about certain elements. And we are opening up a conversation. If anyone would like to join us to learn more about what we just learned, kind of dive into it deeper and understand how we might be able to collaborate as municipalities to make sure we can share some of the capacity of raising ideas into the different codes as they develop. So we don't all have to be islands in and of ourselves, but is there ways that we can kind of collaborate and work together to really advance our lived experience in this process? So if you're interested in engaging in that conversation, please let Sarah or myself know. And Sarah, do we actually have a live poll that people can put in?
As soon as you exit this webinar, you will get an exit survey that asks that question, and you'll also get a follow-up email tomorrow for another opportunity to provide your information.
We need it. We need your information. Yes. So please consider share widely as well. It's really just a learning process, but acknowledging that this is a really, really important area of work, and we're so appreciative for the great work you guys are doing in this space. We're learning a lot, and it's one we should probably pay attention to, but maybe we've been distracted. So we're going to try to fix that. So thank you all. Sarah, back to you.
There we go. Thank you again very, very much. And I hope to see some of you in the audience on a future webinar. Have a great day.